Excuse me, sir. Yo, you got a mask?
I don't have mask.
Then you cannot use the bus if you don't have a mask.
I can't go like this?
No. Thank you.
Transit workers at the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic in the US, like Roberto Martinez, are frustrated and scared.
The transit workers have suffered the most casualties. Why? Because we're in contact with more people on a daily basis.
We spoke with nearly a dozen MTA workers, half of whom agreed to go on camera. They say New York City's Transportation Authority didn't do enough to safeguard them from the effects of the virus ravaging their city.
They dropped the ball.
Passengers are not wearing protective gear, masks, or gloves or anything like that. Nobody really out there to protect us.
New York's MTA is the largest transit network in the United States, with more than 74,000 employees. It's continued operating through the city's lockdown, getting essential workers where they need to go. But MTA employees have watched the virus tear through their ranks. So far, around 2,000 have tested positive and almost 100 have died. That's more than lives lost in the fire and police departments combined. The agency says it acted aggressively to face the worst public health crisis the city has ever seen. But many of the people who keep public transportation running say they feel expendable. Roberto Martinez has been driving through New York for almost 16 years.
I pick up a lot of working class people. I pick up hospital workers because I pass Coney Island Hospital. When you're doing the same route over and over, you establish relationships with a lot of people.
Around mid-March, Roberto's schedule was upended when colleagues around him began falling ill to COVID-19. He says reality set in later that month when his co-workers started dying. At that time, there were fewer than 10 deaths and almost 3,000 confirmed cases in the city.
When it really hit home was when, like I told you earlier, 2 operators in my depot succumbed to this COVID-19 coronavirus. It was Ernesto Hernandez and Miguel Chupita. Ernesto passed away on a Sunday, and I saw him that Tuesday, and we always greet each other with a big handshake or a big hug. And when that Tuesday we crossed one another, we gave each other the elbow.
Roberto's colleague Ernesto Hernandez died in late March, just over a week after New York City shut down most businesses and Governor Andrew Cuomo ordered people to stay home. Roberto says that by then, he and his colleagues had been feeling afraid to go to work for several weeks. They called the MTA's response to the pandemic slow, confusing, and misguided, considering the World Health Organization had declared the virus a pandemic on March 11th. Some transit workers told us that they weren't given enough personal protective equipment early on, and that not all buses and subway cars were following a 72-hour disinfection schedule. On March 26th, the MTA launched its Essential Service Plan to reduce train and bus services and respond to plummeting ridership. But the plan didn't adequately account for crowding at certain stops, often in working-class neighborhoods. And crowding got worse when thousands of operators had to self-quarantine, causing extensive delays. Packed trains and buses made protective gear even more important, but some operators complain that masks and other items were not distributed at all for several weeks. That's despite a long-standing plan that was supposed to make sure the MTA was ready for something like this. Back in 2012, the MTA released a pandemic plan that ensured a stockpile of personal protective equipment, including masks, gloves, and hand sanitizer, lasting 6 weeks. The MTA told us the plan did not account for a highly contagious virus like this one. Still, the agency said the supply of protective gear was not the problem back in early March.
We have a considerable inventory of masks out there, and that's not the issue for this particular virus. What the healthcare professionals are saying, that masks are not recommended and in some cases can be deleterious to your health. So that's the reason we're not issuing masks.
Indeed, a few weeks earlier, the U.S. Surgeon General had told the public to stop buying masks, saying that they didn't prevent the general public from exposure. At the time, some MTA workers who tried to wear their own masks to protect themselves say they were told not to by superiors.
They said, well, if you decided you want to wear personal protective equipment without a plan being in place per the governor of New York State, then you might be violating uniform policies and you could be questioned or addressed about it and maybe disciplined for it.
The MTA told us no employees were ever disciplined for wearing protective equipment, but did not respond to whether workers were ever threatened with disciplinary action. By the beginning of April, the MTA says it distributed tens of thousands of masks. That was about 2 weeks before the governor ordered all New Yorkers to wear masks in public. But for some, it was too late. We received an internal list created by MTA employees noting that about 10 transit workers had already died of COVID-19 by then. While employees were given access to protective gear, Roberto and others say supplies were limited.
I got my bus, and they gave me a paper bag. And inside that bag has one mask, one pair of gloves, and a hand sanitizer. Those 3 items are supposed to last 5 days.
Some locations received masks, most did not. When I came to work, there were no masks. I just happened to have my own. They ran out of gloves. They ran out of hand sanitizer.
The MTA did not respond in time to whether there were any limits to PPE supplies. Still, some employees say they took matters into their own hands. Many bus operators say they began cordoning off their buses with yellow tape to make sure passengers didn't come in through the front door. Some operators even began bringing in their own spray bottles of bleach and water. But even after new steps like prioritized testing for employees and daily temperature checks were announced in mid-April, problems persisted. Under the 72-hour disinfection policy, cleaners leave notes on when buses have been disinfected, but employees don't have access to official disinfection schedules.
Today is Wednesday, April 22nd. It's approximately 5:02 p.m. I'm on bus 235, and the sticker over here indicates that the bus was cleaned on April 18th, which means they're not following the protocol cleaning these buses every 72 hours.
It's especially concerning given the coronavirus can live on steel surfaces like a bus or a subway pole for up to 3 days. Nassar, a bus driver with the MTA for 9 years, says he tested positive for COVID-19 after working on multiple buses in one shift.
The last day that I was at work, I was shifting, or they call it drill tricking, which means that you work inside the depot and you move buses around. I'm maybe doing 4 buses an hour, and I'm doing that for 8 hours. And you can't just like Lysol and spray down a bus every time you jump on it. So I decided, you know what, let me go to the doctor, let me get tested. Sure enough, I tested positive. Could this be it? Am I going to be the one to fight this, or I'm going to be the one to succumb to this?
What would the MTA needed to have done to possibly prevent you from even getting sick doing a shift like that?
I think the protocols for the scrubbing the buses or to decontaminating or disinfecting the buses is not being adhered to strictly.
Nassar has since recovered and is back on the job. The MTA said that all buses adhered to a 72-hour cleaning schedule. Since then, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced all buses and subway cars will be disinfected nightly.
I challenged the MTA to come up with a plan. They came up with a plan. They can disinfect all trains and buses every night. It can best be done by stopping train service from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. every night.
It's an unprecedented endeavor for the MTA, one that will require workers to clean thousands of cars and buses daily. But the agency was still down more than 4,000 employees as of April 20th, following a self-quarantine policy that asked workers to stay home for 14 days if they test positive or come into contact with someone else who has. Meanwhile, buses and trains are still crowded.
You have more people because you have less buses.
Ridership has dropped to never-seen-before levels, more than 90% across all modes of transportation. The agency stands to lose up to $8.5 billion by the end of the year. Meanwhile, it lost money for eliminating bus fares and spent over $300 million on disinfection measures alone. Most buses now have vinyl shield barriers and backdoor boarding. The MTA says it is trying its best to mitigate crowded areas. And to understand the challenges faced by the MTA, it's important to note that the pandemic has overwhelmed public transit agencies across the country. Bus drivers have died from the coronavirus in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Seattle, Newark, and many other cities. But each life lost hits hard.
A guy who I ran with on my slate, his name is Daryl Sweeney. Nicest guy you could possibly meet. Excuse me, I'm sorry. He passed away. I consider he was a friend of mine. I didn't even know he was sick.
The MTA recently announced a $500,000 benefit to families who've lost a loved one to the virus. But many employees are asking for the MTA to do more to prevent them from getting sick, so they can protect their own families.
My father is really at risk. He has diabetes. He's 87 years old, so he's high risk. So why should I go out and bring something back in here that's someone else's responsibility?
For Roberto, he feels the loss of Ernesto and Miguel was preventable.
I know I'm going to miss both those guys. In this case with these two gentlemen, and you could go through the whole garage. In my depot, there's like maybe 800 employees. You will get, everyone say the same thing about these two individuals. They were good men.